morning, everybody. Today we are looking at the history of jazz music, and our first lecture is over work songs and spirituals. So first we need to identify what we're talking about as jazz music. This is the definition of jazz according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Jazz is a musical form, often improvisational, developed by African Americans and influenced by both European harmonic structure and African rhythms. It was developed partially from ragtime and blues and is often characterized by syncopated rhythms, polyphonic ensemble playing, varying degrees of improvisation, often deliberate deviations of pitch, and the use of original timbres. Then the article goes on to say this: any attempt to arrive at a precise, all-encompassing definition of jazz is probably futile. Jazz has been, from its very beginnings at the turn of the 20th century, a constantly evolving, expanding, changing music, passing through several distinctive phases of development. A definition that might apply to one phase, for instance, to New Orleans style or swing, becomes inappropriate when applied to another segment of its history, say, to free jazz. Early attempts to define jazz as a music whose chief characteristic was improvisation, for example, turned out to be too restrictive and largely untrue, since composition, arrangement, and ensembles have also been essential components of jazz for most of its history. So what this is saying is that yes, jazz is a form of music and that it does tend to have certain characteristics, but even inside of jazz, we have a lot of different genres of music. So when we are talking about jazz for this unit, we're talking about jazz-ish pieces of music. So we're going to actually start before I would consider it jazz and go through multiple different kinds of jazz, but none of them are actually called jazz. So jazz is like an overlying title of what this music is. It's not a specific description. It's more like a broad, vague description of the kind of music that we're listening to. So we're going to be talking about the era of jazz, which is roughly 1910 to 1940. We're going to go through some genres of music that eventually lead to jazz. Those genres are work songs and spirituals and ragtime. And then we're going to go into the actual genres of jazz: blues, Dixieland, swing and big band, and bebop. So the first thing we're going to talk about is actually pre-jazz, and they are called work songs. So music was one of the many ways Africans, forced into a new land and stripped of their identity, created a culture of their own. They were able to hold on to their African roots while blending their new American experience. Although oppressed and subjugated throughout American history, African Americans used music as a form of protest and reclaiming of their identity. Creating their own cultural heritage through music as opposed to conforming to the culture that was forced upon them could be seen as a proverbial middle finger raised to white America. So when we're talking about work songs, we're talking about songs that African American slaves would sing in the fields. Also, after slavery was abolished, many African American citizens were thrown into prison because they needed people to work, to create the railroads and to create roads and all of these things that we take for granted today. People actually created those, and a lot of the people who were creating those were people thrown into jail just because of their race. So work songs began much, much earlier than jazz, but they were never written down and they never evolved until slavery was abolished. So let's look at some work songs. Characteristics of work songs. So one characteristic is a call and response. So one person is going to lead the song and the others respond.
I'll be so glad when the sun go down. When the sun go down. I'll be so glad when the sun go down. When the sun go down. Night all let's leave it, but I wanna lie down. I ain't all that sleepy, but I wanna lie down. I wanna lie down, baby. I wanna lie down. I ain't all that sleepy, but I wanna lie down. Oh, what got the matter, baby? Yeah, I can't see. Oh, what got the matter, baby? Yeah, I can't see.
So you can hear in that clip that there's one person leading and then everybody else is responding. You can also hear the slam of their hammers on metal and some chain sound effects. So one characteristic of work songs that's not on this slide is that they're going to have a really steady beat because they're keeping a steady tempo to work to. So if you're in my 8th period class, you can kind of hear how this work song actually sounds a lot like the music of the Maasai tribe that we studied back in week 2 with the call and response. The next characteristic of work songs is that they're very repetitive. The lyrics repeat often, not only from the call to the response, but also in the call itself. So here's another example.
Well, it's Long John, Long John, he's long gone, long gone, he's long gone, he's long gone, he's long gone, long gone. Well, if I had listened, what the roses say, I could been at home, and the roses say, well, if I wouldn't listen, got to running around, first thing I know, I was jail I found, well, I got in jail, with my mouth poked out, well, now I'm in the pen, and I can't get out, it's long gone, it's long gone.
So you could hear they're saying he's long John, he's long gone. There's a lot of repetition, especially of the word long in that example. The last example is of the text being based on a religious topic or religious zeal.
No more, my Lord, no more, my Lord, Lord, I'll never turn back, no more. I found in him may rest and play, and he have made me glad. No more.
All right, so those are our characteristics to remember about work songs. So another genre of music before jazz is called spirituals. And there's a little bleed over between work songs and spirituals because they come from the same culture. A lot of songs can actually be categorized as both. Like the example song that I'm using for this one was on one website, it was called a spiritual, and another website, it was called a work song. So I think that really they're pretty much the same idea. But spirituals tend to be slower, and they are almost required to have religious text. So I'm going to read this slide to you. The lyrics of Negro spirituals were tightly linked with the lives of their authors, slaves. While work songs dealt only with their daily life, spirituals were inspired by the message of Jesus Christ and his good news, the gospel of the Bible. You can be saved. They are different from hymns and psalms because they were a way of sharing the hard condition of being a slave. Slavery was abolished in 1865. Then some African Americans were allowed to go to school. At Fisk University, one of the first universities for African Americans in Nashville, some educators decided to raise funds for supporting their institution. So, some educators and students made tours in the New World and in Europe and sang Negro spirituals. Just after 1865, most African Americans did not want to remember the songs they sung in Hard Days of Slavery. So you're going to notice slaves gained their freedom in 1865, but we don't see the advent of jazz until the 1910s and 1920s. And that's because most African Americans at the time just didn't want to remember all of the songs that they sung when they were slaves. And so there's kind of like a little pause in that musical culture. So slaves would often talk about their overseers in code by referencing them as animals or figures in the Bible, like the Pharaoh. Although work songs were an act of protest, slave masters encouraged them because they saw it as a way of increasing production. They also felt that the work songs were a sign of their slaves' contentment and happiness. Slaves also encoded their songs with secret messages. Wade in the Water is a work song that gave the slaves an intricate and exact guide on how to escape to freedom and away from the bloodhounds. Jordan, or the Promised Land, referenced in the song, represents the non-slave state of Canada. Another way that Wade in the Water is instructing slaves to escape is by telling them to get in the water because the bloodhounds cannot follow the scent if they are in the water. So let's listen to this one.
Wading in the water, wading in the water,
Wading in the water, wading in the water, children, wading in the water. God is gonna trouble these water, wading in the water, wading in the water, children, wading in the water. God is gonna trouble these water. See that band all dressed in white. God is gonna trouble these water. It looked like a band of the Israelites. God is gonna trouble these water. Wading in the water, wading in the water, children, wading in the water. God is gonna trouble these water.
All right, and that's the end of our lecture today. So I hope you learned something new today. There are tons of work songs and spirituals on YouTube if you're interested in listening to more of them. They're very rhythmically pleasing, and the way that they're sung is very emotional and raw. And I think that's one of the things that jazz takes away from work songs and spirituals is the emotion and the rawness of the vocalists. So I hope you guys have a good day.